COOGS House. All right. Now you're going to tell me who called Doug Belk?
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach, Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way we can get the latest on the Cougs into your newsfeed each and every day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. It's good to see you again. We just passed 675 subscribers, so thank you all for hitting subscribe down below. Make sure you join the party and hit subscribe as well. Remember, when we get to every 250 subscribers, we're giving away something. At 750, we're giving away a Galen Robinson designed Letterman style jacket. It's size XL, the size we got, but we give it away at 750 subscribers. So make sure you subscribe down below. That way we can get to 750 subscribers. And then also be commenting and liking the videos. That way we know you are in the contest or you'd like to be in the contest. If, after listening to this episode that is fairly football centric, this episode's football centric, there'll be a shorter bonus episode recapping the basketball game out as well. Actually, probably at the exact same time as you're listening to this. But comment down below if you don't want to talk about the football program at all, if you think aliens are real or not. Now, in looking at this, I don't mean to talk about aliens when we're talking about the football coaching potential moving around, but this episode is prompted initially by a report that came out on Wednesday, I want to say midday, initially reported by Ian Rappaport. I then read the article on Football Scoop. If you are new to football coaching searches, let me recommend Football Scoop. If you're looking for a football coaching job, let me also recommend Football Scoop. It's a great place to find nationally recognized jobs at those like smaller levels, like positionals and GAs and that kind of fun stuff. But per Football Scoop, per Ian Rappaport, the Los Angeles Chargers interviewed Doug Belk for their defensive coordinator position. What? Yes, you heard that correctly. So this story actually goes back a couple of days. Let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, earlier this week, and Locked On Chargers did a great job of covering this, but the LA Chargers actually lost their defensive coordinator, Ronaldo Hill, when he went to go be, and I'm reading this correctly, the passing game coordinator for the Dolphins defensive coordinator, Vic Fangio. So he actually left and moved across the country from the West Coast to South Beach to be a lesser coach, or a lesser in the totem pole coach in Miami for Vic Fangio. Now, worth pointing out, when Vic Fangio had been a head coach in the past, that Hill had been his defensive coordinator. So like they have a working history. That makes a little bit of sense. Also worth pointing out that in Los Angeles, head coach Staley was apparently the one calling the defense, if I'm understanding things correctly. So it wasn't like they lost their defensive play caller. The immediate report was that Derek Ainsley would be promoted from a secondary coach, who was coaching the entire secondary, the back half of the defense, to the Chargers defense coordinator. But it sounds like, A, they haven't made that hire yet, but B, because it's a formal job posting, they're going to follow the Rooney Rule. If you're a college sports fan that's not familiar with the NFL's Rooney Rule, every single coach's opening does require the interview of a minority candidate. It's making sure that people get equitable experiences, and frankly, it's a way to try and like keep like the old boys club that is coaching circles, right? That's where Doug Belk comes in. Now, Doug Belk is not the only person being interviewed, which is why I think it's interesting that the running rule thing is tied to this, because they're also interviewing Patriots D-line coach. Where did I pull his name? I just had it. DeMarcus Covington. So they're obviously talking to more than one person, and both people would fulfill the Rooney Rule. So they just need to check that box off. They could have just interviewed DeMarcus Covington, and it would have been a big step up for him. But they didn't. They interviewed both. Now, I don't think there's any real fire to this smoke. It might just be more of a steam. But I think that it's worth pointing out that like Doug Belk is at least attractive enough of a candidate for the Los Angeles Chargers to think they need to interview him as defensive coordinator of Houston. Now, I can see you shaking your head already. Yeah, I get it. They let up 77 points to SMU and Tanner Mordecai. I remember that game as well. But I will say that a lot of people are really intrigued by Doug Belk, and frankly, they look at the work he did with the 2021 team that went 12-2, had a couple pro corners on it, right? And like think of him as a defensive sharp mind that maybe wasn't working with the most talent last season. The defensive line still ranked pretty well on Pro Football Focus and all of those things. And frankly, the secondary, you could argue, was lesser experienced, maybe had overperformed because of good coaching the year before, etc. Right? That's all. If you want to have that argument in the comments, go for it. I'm not going to sit there and bash Doug Belk after one bad year because I was really high on the year before, and I don't know that I can just wish-wash back and forth. I will say that if he continues to have more years like 2022, that might be more the norm. If he has like years that bounce back to feeling more like 2021, that might feel like more the norm. So, I think that the jury is still out, relatively speaking. The interesting thing in all this, and the most football scoop way, if you're familiar with the site, this makes sense. If not, it's like very in the weeds on things. But Doug Belk worked with Derek Ainsley, the guy replacing the defense coordinator before the rule thing got pulled out, I guess. The probable hire and secondary coach there in LA. They worked together at a grad assistant type level at Alabama before Belk started working for Holgorsen at West Virginia. So Belk is a young coach, an up-and-coming coach, and I see why other people are looking at him. I don't know if he's quite... The pro game is a whole different game, right? And I'm not sure that if I'm him, I'm jumping into the pro game, unless it's really about the pro salary, because I would understand if he was saying, hey, that Big 12 money yet, it hadn't trickled down to the coordinator spot yet. And while that money is coming, and I would imagine his next extension at U of H would be a Big 12 sized extension, he didn't have it yet, right? So I get that. I also could see this being a leverage play where he's like, hey, listen, other people want me. You're going to pay me, right? That kind of a move. I also could see it bluntly just being, even if he doesn't necessarily want the job right now, I think he's 35, right? Maybe this is just honestly, and we all have done this, right? Practice, right? Practice the interview, see the process, like understand what kind of questions they're asking for, what they're looking for, because it is a different kind of football. That said, I've maintained that while I do think Belk got a really great 2021 season, the thing he does best for Houston is recruit. He recruits. He has an eye for talent. He has a way to convince big name and big star prospects to come to Houston. He does a great job recruiting kids. And frankly, you don't recruit kids in the NFL. Now, I obviously there's some translation to like a free agent signing. I don't mean to say there's not, but there's not a traditional recruitment process. You're not going around and shaking mom's hand, right? That's not quite how you pull guys in. You go to the draft, you do the measurables, you watch the tape, you make the pick, right? Once you make the pick, they got to come. And so it's not quite the same. I'm not sure it plays into his strengths, but it got me into this interesting thought experiment, which was if the Chargers offered Doug Belk on Friday, who comes next? And when I posted on Twitter, I got some interesting crowdsourcing options and answers. Feel free to throw your comments down below or go back and forth with me on Twitter. I'll be happy to talk to you there at Painsworth512. But I want to get into some 3 names that I thought were interesting. One of which is from crowdsourcing in the next segment. But first, let's talk a little bit about FanDuel. Now, FanDuel is our newest sports betting partner here at Locked On Cougs and Locked On Network, and we're really excited because it's the number one sports book in America. The midway point of the NBA season is here. It's actually here, right? And it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sports app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained and more. Now, the line I'm going to talk about is an NBA line because Thursday night, the Rockets are back in action and they're playing the Golden State Warriors. Now, once upon a time, and I swear to my young listeners, this was not that long ago, but once upon a time, the Rockets would beat the Warriors like 49% of the time, right? Those 1% of the time, that was the difference or whatever. Yes, they did lose them in the playoffs and Western Conference Finals. Those things had happened, but these games used to be competitive. I don't think this one is. The line is set at Warriors -10. I think this is much more than a double-digit victory. I don't care if who's playing or who's in the lineup, who's resting, who's not resting for the Warriors. That team is talented, that team is well coached, and that team has aspirations to move up the seeding. and Houston has aspirations to go get Victor Wembanyama. So I imagine this is more than a double-digit win for the Warriors, and so I'm taking them. But I'm not a pessimist. I'm not anti-Houston. I think it's a victor play for them. So that's my read on that one. I'm saying you should do it at FanDuel. FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss your chance to get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/locked-on. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on to learn more. Make every moment more. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so I said in my second segment I want to talk a little bit about names I thought were interesting, and let's talk one at first about the crowdsourced name. Quickly threw names out there and got one back. Levy Smith. Now, Levy Smith coached a tremendous defense, obviously in the Chicago Bears, Brian Urlacher days, and spent 5 seasons, if I'm counting correctly, at Illinois with not the greatest success as a head coach. But I will say, in looking at his statistics and numbers, that it was interesting to look at, like, defensively, his defenses weren't horribly off kilter considering how outmanned they were in the Big Ten. What I think I like a lot about him as a defensive coordinator too, though, is he knows Texas. He's from Sandy, Texas. That's up in like the northeastern part of, that's like further north, but not quite as east as like Tyler and Lufkin and Longview and those kinds of things, if my geography serves me correctly, right? He gets Texas, he understands Texas, and frankly, he's a really good candidate right here in town. And I know that like seems silly, but you could really quickly get him acquainted with the culture and things that are going on at Houston, because you got spring ball starting in less than a week. Right, less than a week. And that's an important piece of this too, is if you're going to be doing defensive installs on day one, you need to have a defensive coordinator in place. I'm not sure it's a long-term hire. I would hope so. I'd hope they give him a real chance. But his defenses did perform better than I think expected. And I say better than expected because like they did give up, a handful of touchdowns. What was this? I have in 2020, they gave up just over two rushing touchdowns and just over 2 passing touchdowns a game. So yes, they did give up 28 points a game in college football. However, when you look at like the guys on his roster versus like the talents coming out of the Ohio States and those kind of things, like that was a high scoring league, believe it or not, in a lot of ways. The other thing I think is interesting in this is that I would think in playing to the state of Texas recruits homes, and in pulling kids into the University of Houston, the pro experience might actually be the better play for him because he knows what it is like to be a great pro defensive player. He's coached them. And frankly, I would think that that'd be a good selling point. You see pro guys do this at the college level as, coordinator to coordinator kind of stuff a little bit more often. You see head coach to head coach kind of stuff, right? Because head coach and managing the teams are very different. But as a coordinator goes, like sing ball is sing ball. I thought that was an interesting option. It was crowdsourced, and I appreciate that. So I want to shout that out because that was a creative thought. My initial thought, and I also saw people say this, but this is already in my notes. I don't mean to take credit away from people that said it in comments, but I also think that defensive line coach Brian Early clearly has a beat on the defense. Now, in promoting him to a defensive coordinator, the I think obvious issue is that the D-line coach, as far as an X's and O's perspective, is probably the farthest removed from what a traditional defensive coordinator would be. I think that the interesting thing there is that you'd probably need, not that he would need people calling plays with him, but you probably also need some sort of a defensive passing coordinator. And does Houston do something towards like working toward fixing that, or does Houston have like the guy on staff already? I don't know. Doug Belk does a lot of the secondary stuff on his own. So I think that would have to be someone within staff that is probably fairly removed from that. What I also think is, in looking at this, like the pros to Brian Early might outweigh the cons, but I'm not positive. He's clearly a culture setter, right? The Sac Avenue defensive line thing, even as poor and porous as the defense felt at times in 2022, the defensive line always graded out really, really well. And I don't think that that's an accident. Now, if Brian Early were to get promoted and need some help in the secondary, I wonder if you like elevate the David Rowe role a little bit or something like that to kind of help him out. because those are such different and distant positions. Brian Early's entire coaching career does revolve around the defensive line. If I go back to like his earliest stages of his coaching career, he was a special teams coordinator in Central Arkansas, and at Fayetteville High School, right in Arkansas, he was a defensive coordinator, and at West Memphis High School, he was a defensive coordinator. So that's obviously a little different, but his most extensive college experience has all been defensive line. And the culture he's built there is great. I think it'd be a great fit for a little while. I don't know how permanent it would be. But I thought that was an interesting idea. And frankly, if I'm looking at the staff, because the continuity of having him do it in such a short window and having already been on staff would be nice. And then B, I think if the Sac Avenue culture could work and take over the entire defense, you'd at least be intense, right? I'm not sure that how much better the defense would be as a whole, but you'd at least be intense. As far as other on-staff guys go, I mentioned that David Rowe would be like a natural replacement because it'd be a secondary guy to a secondary guy, and Coach Doug Belk, as the associate head coach and defensive coordinator, works a lot with the secondary, right? I mean, just go listen to Marcus Jones talk about him. That clearly has a clear tie with corners and safeties. The other guy I could see, obviously, Archie McDaniel being the linebackers coach would be a fairly obvious fit. I don't know what other kind of guys you could go with around there. It is interesting, and you look at this because they didn't replace Shannon Dawson because Dawson was an offensive coordinator, an offensive play caller, and Holgorsen was able to step up and fill that role because, if we're being honest, he may have been doing that role some himself down the stretch of the season. On the defense side of the ball, if Belk were to leave, I don't think that's going to happen, right? He can't call the offense and the defense. That's just way too much on a college football coach's plate. But also, he's never been a defensive guy. That wouldn't be up his alley anyway. The one guy I want to talk a little bit about that is off script is a guy named Kurt Maddox. Kurt Maddox is D coordinator at San Diego State. And while you might look at San Diego State's 7-6 record last year, their loss in the Hawaii Bowl, and be like, why would we want that guy? I would point to that in the year prior, they were 12-2 and allowed less than 2.5 touchdowns a game. And what that means is that while San Diego State is not like power whatever football they play in the MWC, the Midwest Conference, he clearly understands coaching and game planning and so on. This past season, even though they did like regress to the mean more as like wins and losses go, they still only gave up 2.6 touchdowns per game. So the defense was there. The offense was just not. It looks like their quarterback, they had one guy throw 10 picks, one guy throw 3 picks. They had trouble moving the football offensively. And that's not necessarily on Maddox as the D coordinator there. I would think he'd be an easy promotion as a guy, frankly, promotion because he's moving into the Power 5 and coming to Houston, right? I don't know how much people would have thought from San Diego State to the U of H prior to the U of H moving up in conferences would have mattered. But Kurt Maddox, I think, would see that as a chance to go coach higher caliber athletes because now you're watching a guy coach Big 12 caliber athletes. It also moves him closer to like his like home base in a lot of ways. Think about like guys recruiting where they're originally from. Maddox did a lot of his coaching prior to San Diego State in the Kentucky area, the Valparaiso of the world, Eastern Kentucky's of the world. And I wonder if he had an easier time getting those guys to Houston than he might getting all those connections and getting all those guys out San Diego State. Admittedly, though, San Diego State does have its own recruiting built in however many miles to the west once you get to the water, right? So I would be interested if this whole Belk thing were to go through and he were to take a bigger job somewhere else. I would be interested in seeing Kurt Maddox come through with the interview. I think really highly of that defense in a short time period there at San Diego State. He's done very, very well, even if the team's win-loss record does not show it. So that's my thoughts there. In the third segment, I want to kind of deviate away from coaching and talk a little bit about other football topic, conference realignment. All right, so in conference realignment, I do think that what's interesting is to look at the Pac-12. Now, obviously, Houston's not moving into the Pac-12, so don't set off any alarms. But Houston's moving into the Big 12, right? the Big 12 is losing its two money makers prior to Houston getting there in the University of Texas at Austin and Oklahoma at Norman. Now, in doing that, the thought is that, okay, well, at least in the first 2023 season, there'll be 14 teams. And then 2024, you're looking at 12 teams, those teams leaving, and like you have your Big 12. But nearby, the Pac-12 is falling apart. UCLA and USC are moving to the Big 10. And it looks like a lot of those teams are looking for ways to jump ship to more valuable conferences because the conference, as far as the perception goes for TV deals, is not being valued very highly. We've talked before about, do you add the Corner 4 schools, right? You already have BYU coming in. You go get Colorado back because they were in the original Big 12. You'll get University of Utah because that program has grown a lot athletically and just in the football sense. And you get like the Arizona States in the world because that's nearby. And then suddenly you can go coast to coast. We've heard Brett Yormark talk about how he wants the conference to go coast to coast. The goal being that you'd have every single time zone and thus every single time slot on a college football Saturday in which you could have the primetime game. You could have a primetime game happening in Central Florida, right? Orlando, East Coast time. You could have a primetime football game happening in the state of Texas, Houston, or pick one. You have a primetime football game happening at BYU, as we've seen that program be strong in the past, right? In the mountain time zone. And if you add the West Coast, you can get all the way to the Pacific time zone and have the late night football game as well. You could theoretically hit every single marker across the country and make that TV deal really, really pop. Especially when the pop is compared to what the Pac-12 is currently getting offered. The Pac-12 is only getting offers of significance, I should say, from some streaming deals like an Apple TV deal. Now, Apple TV has some fun shows. Shouts to Ted Lasso coming back. But on the whole, I believe I saw a ranking that had them at the 9th largest in terms of revenue TV streaming service, right? So they're not even one of the top streamers in the game, and that's what they really get into. So getting them into sports, moving away from something that they weren't the best at in the first place, feels like, are they moving laterally, if at all? Then you factor in that the streaming service, Apple TV, only wants the marquee matchup. Think about that, like the way NBC gets like one SEC game a weekend, right? Like it's usually Alabama, but they get like one SEC game a weekend. That's all Apple TV wants from the Pac-12, right? And they're having trouble finding the same kind of dollar amount that they think that the schools are worth in some sort of a combo deal with ESPN and Fox, whereas ESPN has that deal in place for the 2024-5 school year through the 2031 the end of 2031. And then you imagine they re-up and only go upwards because the deals continue to go upwards on these things. And frankly, the deal they're currently on is already more than the Pac-12 is looking at potentially signing for. So the goal then becomes, with all of those things going on and all the negative talk around this Apple Plus deal that just came out, where they only want one game, Oregon, as a school that would almost always be that game, feels up for grabs. And now I have arguments for why I think they should come to the Big 12. And I feel like there are probably Big 10 people that feel like they should go to the Big 10. However, my argument for the Big 12 would be if you could get Oregon and Washington to the Big 12, right? You probably also have to take in their rivals, right? So you all have to take in Oregon State, Washington State. Cool, right? Suddenly, you could have like a Big 12 West in which you have more or less the Pac-12 teams you're pulling in plus BYU. You could have a Big 12 Central, and you could have even potentially divide that into like a North and South, because that's where the bulk of your teams are in the Texas and surrounding areas. So you have Houston, you have Baylor, you have Tech, you have Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, right? You could somehow divide that into a North and South. And then you have the East, in which you have UCF, Cincinnati, West Virginia. As long as we have West Virginia, I maintain I could see a world where they leave. But for now, right? And then suddenly you could have like 4 quadrants and divisions. Now, do you bump Houston to the East because technically they're the farthest East? Or do you bump like Iowa State East because, well, Iowa's not very far to the East. It's kind of on its own in the state of Iowa for the Big 12 or whatever, right? Do you bump some school to, from the West, to more of the Central because Colorado's a little bit different? Maybe. But all I'm saying is there's a world here where you pull in all of these Pac-12 schools and make a 4-pronged, like, big 18 conference, right? I guess Big 20 would be more easily divisible by 4. But then you have like things start to fall into place for you. It's just 4 different divisions. You play this many games. You play your whole division, and then you play this many games out of division, and that rotates or whatever. Those are really easy logistics to figure out. And suddenly you've got your coast-to-coast conference. You've got power schools in every time zone, and you can really play this thing out in a way that makes a lot of money for that 2031 deal. And we know the Pac-12 doesn't have any money now, so we know it's a positive play for them. Now, I'm going to dive into that deeper at some point in the near future. We got a lot of sports to cover here at U of H, though, and so we'll be covering all that in a later episode more in depth. That's just my 2 cents on it right now. When I saw that Apple deal drop lower than people expected. If you want to talk to me about conference alignment, Doug Belk, coaching hires, coaching potential hires, etc., find me at Painsworth5, which is PAINSWORTH 512 on Twitter, Instagram, and all your various social media handles. Remember, there's also a bonus episode out at this moment about the Houston Tulane basketball games. So make sure to go check that out as well. Thank you all so much for tuning in today and making Locked On Cougs your first and potentially second listen of the day. If you're looking for another thing to listen to this morning, let me recommend Locked On Big 12 because they're covering all of this conference nonsense. They did a crossover episode with Locked On Pac-12 as well to talk about the potential coming together of conferences. We're already doing it here at Locked On. We're bringing the shows together too. We're getting ahead of the curve. So make sure to check out Locked On Big 12 as well. Josh does a great job breaking all those things down. Thank you again for tuning in today. Make sure to subscribe down below. Locked On Cougs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team, on our basketball team's case, the number 1 team in the country. Every day, go Cougs.